Next, we have Dr. Claudette Grinnell-Davis, is an assistant professor at the Ann and Henry Zarrow School of Social Work at University of Oklahoma, Tulsa. Prior to completing her PhD in social work and psychology at the University of Michigan, she provided family reunification and children's mental health services. Dr. Grinnell-Davis's research examines origins of child maltreatment, youth becoming parents in foster care, and the role of culturally affirmative early childhood education. Welcome, Dr. Claudette Grinnell-Davis. Thank you for being here.
Good afternoon. Thank you for having me here. Bonjour, Minyo Gijigad. My name is Claudette Grinnell-Davis. I am a faculty member here at the University of Oklahoma at the School of Social Work. And more importantly to this conversation and all of the many hats that I wear, Anishinaabekwe. I am an Anishinaabe woman. I identify as a descendant of the intermarriage between Anishinaabewin women of the Georgian Bay and Lake Huron regions in Canada and French fur traders. The term for that technically is à la façon du pays, or country marriages. And my clan heritage is the Loon. And I don't know if you saw the painting behind me here a little bit first at the very beginning, but that is a depiction of my heritage. We were the people who were responsible in my tribe for internal communication. And so that's a little bit about me and my relevance to this. What makes this complicated and why I go into this up front in talking about thinking more deeply about Indigenous child welfare practice is that the reality is being Indigenous in the United States is complicated. So what I'm going to do before we get talking about Indigenous child welfare, I'm going to talk a little bit about what it means to be Indigenous. I'm going to talk a little bit about what that looks like in the US context, in particular to the history of Oklahoma, which we know is complex, and then talk a little bit about what we know about the state of Indigenous youth who are in foster care in the United States in non-tribal systems. So first, according to the UN, there are very specific definitions to what it means to be Indigenous. And this is one of the things that's fundamentally important to understand. One of the fundamental roots and bases of being Indigenous is about land. Indigenous people are much more likely to identify specifically to where they are from, where they identify as their space. Our languages are constructed inherently around who we are, where we've been, where we've come from. I am currently sitting in the re-recognized Creek Reservation here in Tulsa County. However, before this land was given to the Creeks, it was historically the land of the Wichita, the Caddo, and the Comanche, who used it primarily as hunting territory. So land in Oklahoma is very complicated, on top of all of the identity issues, because there's the land, there's the people who lived here before the US put its deportation policies into place, and then there are the people who lived here after deportation. So definitions of indigeneity include things like self-identification, not only at the individual level, but also at the community level. A recognition of continuity with pre-colonial society. So, you know, here that would be prior to European invasion. And by the way, that's not just from the English and the French coming east to west across the United States, but in actuality, the first colonial contact in what is now the United States actually came up through Mexico. It was with the Spanish, and then also along the coast. Somewhat less through trade routes along the Atlantic coast, but primarily through the American Southwest. The oldest standing building currently in Santa Fe is dated to 1610 and contains in it one of the few examples of indigenous writing from an iconography that predates European colonialism. So it's important to understand that context. It's not just about the British and the French starting from the east and moving west, but it's also coming up from the south as well. Strong links to our territory, strong links to our resources, identifying as having distinct systems, distinct language, distinct culture, distinct beliefs. And something also to know here is that as a part of the United Nations, as understanding what it means to be indigenous, nearly every major indigenous language on earth is considered by UNESCO to be endangered. This includes the 4 most commonly spoken indigenous languages in the United States, which are Navajo, Cree, Ojibwe, and Cherokee. They are all considered also to be indigenous by the UN. We tend to be non-dominant groups. We usually have resolved to maintain our distinct systems and our ties to our ancestral environments. And just so we're clear on this, we're not talking about a small group of people. We're talking about 370 million people across 70 countries and all 6 continents. This includes Europe. There are indigenous people in Europe, mostly in the northern Scandinavian regions. But that's important to understand that, you know, what it means to be indigenous is a global concept. But in the United States, it's particularly complicated. There are 574 recognized tribal nations, tribal towns, and native villages. And that latter category of native village applies strictly to the state of Alaska. In addition to those 574 tribal nations are 68 other entities that are recognized by the states, but not by the United States. And there's a very complex reason for that. It's more than we can get into here. But some of those state tribal entities are just as active and just as culturally tied and just as involved in their community lives as federally recognized tribes are. The best example of a very vigorous state recognized but not federally recognized tribe is the United Howman Nation in the state of Louisiana. One of my fellow colleagues in Indigenous social work nationally, who is now at Arizona State, is a member of the United Howman Nation, and she is very active in the life of her tribe. So some other groups, though, that we don't necessarily think of being indigenous, but who are indigenous in relationship to the US held territory and prior US held territory include, number 1, Native Hawaiians. You know, I'm not going to get too much into the Americans' role in the deliberate deposing of the last monarch of Hawaii in 1893, but yeah, we did that. Pacific Islanders, and these are usually people that are connected to what used to be called the Trust Territory of the Pacific, that now constitutes places like Guam, Tinian, Saipan, the Marshall Islands, Micronesia, and American Samoa. Technically, they are all considered indigenous for the sake of how it works in the United States. And then there are the people who live in the United States who are indigenous, who come here from other places. And this is important to know here in Tulsa, because there is one particular group who has their highest concentration outside of their ancestral territory in Tulsa who are considered indigenous, and those are refugees from Myanmar. In particular, in Tulsa, we're talking about the Zomi. So most of these folks who are immigrants from other places who come to the US who are considered indigenous are people who are usually considered refugees. The Hmong are also included here. They were a substantial part of a number of the people who ended up in the US following the Vietnam War and are still very strongly present in the United States, particularly in the Central California Valley, Wisconsin, and a few other places. And then also, it's important to recognize too that a number of people that we have a propensity to think of as Latino who come from Latin America are in fact indigenous. There are a number of people who live in the United States who are Guatemalan, El Salvadoran, Honduran, from many of the countries in Central America, even from Mexico, if they are from, you know, the southern states, Oaxaca, Michoacan, places like that, where they may not speak Spanish. They may actually consider themselves to be part of indigenous groups and speak Zapotec or Nahuatl or Maya or various indigenous languages. So it's important to understand how that works, even though I'm going to talk primarily here about American and Canadian indigeneity. It's important to understand that indigeneity is a lot more than just in Oklahoma being Indian. So this comes to the question about who gets to define who's indigenous. And this is complicated from a governmental standpoint. It's also very complicated from a personal standpoint because, you know, I mentioned federal recognition of tribes. Along with that comes the right of tribes to identify their own members and define their own citizens. And oh, by the way, every tribe has their own definition. Just because you know one tribe's definition does not guarantee you know everybody else's definition. And then it's also complicated because there are people out there who are culturally indigenous, who are practitioners of our cultural traditions, but who are not in any way politically recognizable. So for myself, for instance, I am still looking through my genealogy for my quote unquote anchor relative to attach me to a particular group within the Métis Nation of Ontario. But I was raised with practices. I was raised with the traditions. I was raised with the stories. And so I identify culturally as Métis, even though politically that identity is far more ambiguous. And that's a reality in actuality for a number of Indigenous people living in the United States. And lest we mention Elizabeth Warren, the whole question of blood quantum does not help. The reality is prior to colonialism, tribes, tribal structures, tribal relationships were a lot more fluid. Even within my own history with the Anishinaabe people, we have what are now known as the Three Fires Confederacy. It's a long-standing organization between various tribes in the Great Lakes regions, founded around AD 900, consisting of three primary groups, two of which can be found in Oklahoma. The Ojibwe, which is still the group primarily up in the north. The Ottawa, a small number of whom got deported here to Oklahoma and can be found up in aptly Ottawa County. And then the Citizen Potawatomi Nation. But our boundaries and our identities prior to the institution of tribes as governmental entities was much more fluid. So that whole question of DNA and blood quantum, what does it really tell us? If you ask Kim Tallbear, who is a Cree scholar at the University of Alberta, she will tell you it doesn't tell you much. Dorothy Roberts, the race and law scholar at the University of Pennsylvania, will tell you it means absolutely nothing. And I highly recommend her book, Fatal Invention, subtitled How Science, Politics, and Big Business Recreate Race in the 21st Century. It is a really eye-opening read, and I highly recommend it. And then there are the other complications, usually related to so-called eyeball tests. It is literally sometimes referred to as the Hollywood eyeball test. Do you look Indian enough? Do you live on a reservation? Do you live, and some of the questions that you get asked when people find out you're Indian are ridiculous, just saying. But all of that relates to this kind of eyeballing of who's Indigenous and who isn't, and also consequently a fetishization of Indigenous people as being exotic. And all that just serves to complicate and muddy the waters around identifying who's Indigenous. And it especially comes complicated within Indigenous communities, as Indigenous communities sometimes in somewhat overtly hostile ways will police each other around being Indigenous enough. Now, why does all of this matter? Oh, it matters for so many reasons. Number one is that all of this complication and fighting around who's Indigenous and who isn't really feeds into the history of colonialism and genocide. In many ways, this is exactly what Andrew Jackson had in mind, and people like him, when they sought out pretty much to destroy and dismantle Indigenous culture in the United States. And not just here, but this has also happened around the world. It's happened in Australia, it's happened in New Zealand, it's happened in Canada, it's happened in other places. And it speaks to the success of it. And I want to show you a little bit about, in a pictorial matter, how successful this has been. So here's a map of the United States. The yellow states are all states that have federally recognized tribes. The orange states have federal and state recognized tribes, and the red states have only state recognized tribes. Now, with the exception of New Hampshire, all those other gray states, there are descendants of the tribes that used to live in those states living in Oklahoma right now. And most of those people started getting pushed down to Oklahoma, not after 1830, although Andrew Jackson still had a role to play in it. He just was playing that role as a military official rather than as president of the United States, along with other people like William Henry Harrison and other military officials. So Pennsylvania, Ohio, West Virginia, those used to be the land of the Delaware, the Seneca, the Cayuga, the Kickapoo, the Shawnee. Are these names sounding familiar from Oklahoma? The Miami, the Peoria. Get down into Missouri, and we're talking about the Oto, the Missouria, the Quapaw. Quapaw came from Arkansas. Tennessee, there were people of Cherokee, Chickasaw, and Creek heritage living in Tennessee who also got pushed here. So in many ways, there are no people from those tribes, or should I say there are no tribal entities in those states anymore, in large part because they all got pushed here to the state of Oklahoma. And the reason, again, why this matters, because sovereignty matters. We know all about this now following McGirt here in Tulsa. Tribal sovereignty matters. Not only that, but because there are service provisions attached to aspects of tribal sovereignty. And those service provisions are attached not only to tribal membership, but for those who are not tribal memberships, but who are identified as being descendants of Native people, they are also eligible for certain services. So there's tribal membership, and then there's something that we call CDIB status, or Certificate of Degree of Indian Blood. There are certain services that you're eligible for if you carry a CDIB, independent of whether you're a tribal member or not. And the reason why this matters, really matters, is because of the Indian Child Welfare Act. The Indian Child Welfare Act is one of the fundamental pieces of sovereignty in the United States. Because what the Indian Child Welfare Act does is it gives tribes the right to protect its own citizens and to have a say in their citizens' welfare outside of their own tribal jurisdictions. Okay. The reason why we have ICWA is because of the boarding schools. So 1879, the first boarding school is instituted at Carlisle, Pennsylvania, the Carlisle Training School. And a stunning number of youths who were sent to those boarding schools died there. The first original students who went to the boarding schools were actually war hostages. They were actually the sons of war chiefs of the Northern Great Plains. So the Cheyenne, the Arapaho, the Lakota, Nakota, Dakota, other members of the Oseti-Sakowin, or the Great Sioux Nation. Once you reached 5 or 6, attendance was for the most part compulsory at the boarding schools, and this resulted in losses of language, losses of kin structure, losses of tradition, losses of practice, not only for the children, but also for their parents. Because there became a whole bunch of shame around language. Families were no longer able to communicate with each other if children went away to boarding schools, because the children would come home, they would know only English or primarily English, and the parents would not know English. So children couldn't talk to each other. There was loss of ceremony, the significant loss as a result, and all intentionally orchestrated. Not to mention the broken hearts. Very few Indian families escaped the boarding school era without the loss of a child at the boarding school. So by 1928, when the Merriam Report was written, and in fact, the Merriam Report is subtitled "The Destruction of the American Indian Family." The damage was significant. And this report led in 1934 to something that was referred to as the New Deal for American Indian Tribes, beginning with the Indian Reorganization Act. This allowed tribes to reconstitute themselves and to have their own governmental structures. However, under the Eisenhower administration, Eisenhower is not remembered as being friendly to Indigenous people. People from tribes were encouraged to resettle into urban areas because of the poverty of reservations. And a way of forcing people to do that was by de-recognizing some of the tribes. Where that happened the most pointedly to tribal groups we know here in Oklahoma is with the Ponca. The Osni Ponca were split. There was the Ponca tribe of Oklahoma, Ponca tribe of Nebraska. Ponca tribe of Oklahoma stayed recognized. The Ponca tribe of Nebraska was de-recognized. The irony about that is that the person who is known most as being the head of the Ponca, and the reason why who's viewed as a leader and as a hero to Native American people because of his role in relationship to American Indians being viewed by the federal government as human under the law, Standing Bear, was a Nebraska Ponca. And there is actually a statue of Standing Bear here in Oklahoma in Ponca City too. But the point is, there were a whole bunch of derecognition of tribes, which resulted in the 1970s, consequently, in re-recognition. And just because tribes were moved from the reservations back into the urban centers did not mean that things worked any better for them. So by 1974, now we're getting into ICWA, 40% of all Indian children in the US were in child welfare custody, and the vast majority of them were with non-Indian families. So loss of culture. Some of this was literally the buying and selling of Indian children to be adopted by white families. Literally, this is documented well from the 1950s. So when the Indian Child Welfare Act was instituted in 1978, what it did was two things. Number one, gave tribes with their own courts the right to exclusive jurisdiction in cases on Indian land involving Indian kids. Now, what about Indian land, or what about Indian kids not on Indian land? What that gave us the right to concurrent presumptive parties. So what that means is that a tribe can enter into a case in a state court as an interested party because that child is their citizen. And that's the important thing to keep in mind, because that child is their citizen. In order to be protected under ICWA, the parents have to be tribal citizens or eligible for tribal citizenship, and so must the child. There are some states that will allow children to be ICWA protected if the parent is a citizen, but the child is not eligible. The state of Michigan is one of those. But for the most part, to be guaranteed of ICWA protection, the parent has to be a citizen, the child has to be a citizen, which means, sorry, Goldwater Institute, ICWA is not race-based, because approximately at best, the estimates are maybe 40% of Indian children in the United States are actually ICWA protectable. The vast majority of Indigenous children in the United States are actually not ICWA protectable because of citizenship. Now, thinking beyond ICWA and thinking deeply about the needs of Indigenous kids in care, here's why this really matters, and it has to do with historical trauma. Because just because you're not a tribal member, just because you're no longer eligible for citizenship and services and protections, does not mean that you do not embody the lived experience of historical trauma. It does not mean that you have not experienced loss. It does not mean that you have not had an experience that detaches you from your social identity. We know this just in anecdotal day-to-day life around Indian kids. There are Indian kids out there in the United States who are 100% Indigenous, but they are not protectable under ICWA because of the way that their tribal percentages and memberships break up. Okay. So when we anchor being Indian very closely to the political identification of being a tribal citizen, we run the risk of actually doing kinds of clinical damage based upon this intergenerationally transmitted notion of loss, which is magnified by the fact that for some of these people, they don't have a political right to a protection that they culturally identify with and feel very strongly. Which brings us to Indigenous youth and foster care. And here I'm exclusively talking about American Indian and Alaskan Native youth. Hawaiian youth are a different situation. Here's what we know, and this is why we need to go a little bit deeper and think a little bit deeper about Indigenous child welfare. We know from the data, we can't say anything about ICWA. The data that we collect at the national level on the child welfare system does not allow us to say anything about ICWA at all, because that identity is solely established by the worker and how they report race or cultural affinity. Nothing to do with tribal membership. So again, here's the calculated estimate, and this is by my research that I'm in the process of writing up for publication. Only about 40% of the youth in national foster care data who are identified as Indigenous are in all likelihood ICWA protected. There's a complicated way that I've gotten there, but let's just say this. The majority of youth who are Indigenous in foster care are not ICWA protectable. But even with ICWA, we still see a gross overrepresentation of American Indian youth in the system, probably 3 times the level they should be in the system. Furthermore, what happens to them as they leave care ends up being the same, regardless of whether they're ICWA protected or not. And the older a youth is, the more likely they are to be in a group placement, in a congregate placement, and not to be in an ICWA aligned placement. So the longer you stay in foster care, the more detached you become from your identity, which is a real problem for youth, because from a developmental standpoint, from an adolescent developmental standpoint, identity is what adolescence is all about. And here they are in adolescence with this identity, not knowing who they are. And it causes substantial existential crisis for many of these young people. It translates when they age out of foster care to some really scary outcomes, because they are more likely than other youth of other ethnicities and races to experience homelessness and incarceration. And they are also more likely not to identify having an important supportive adult. What do we do? And I will say that the challenges are significant, and part of it is wrapped up in the fact that tribes are usually running with limited resources, and their primary focus is on ICWA and tribal sovereignty. And by saying what I'm about to say, I am not in any way watering down or poo-pooing sovereignty. I will defend sovereignty, even though I will never benefit from it till the day I die. But adherence to ICWA is no guarantee that an Indian child's well-being is being sought after. This is not to be critical of tribes. They have limited resources, limited capacity. Conversation that I had with Kate Fort, who runs the Indigenous Law Clinic at Michigan State University, is that the single biggest detriment to Indian youth in the foster care system and Indian child welfare generally is the fact that ICWA is an unfunded mandate, and there is very little money that is actually given to tribes to support their ability to support their own child welfare systems. And those who do, and do it well, most of that income usually comes from casino revenues or other entrepreneurial enterprises. So what I want to propose here is something that I call aunties work. And by aunties work, what I mean is going back to our matriarchal traditional leadership and looking at the kin networks, and especially the role of aunties, because aunties are the people who keep the networks alive. They maintain the tribal traditions. Aunties have important roles in raising kids in tribal communities. And we know this is an issue. We know that Indigenous youth in state custody, and we know this about Oklahoma youth, they want to know who they are. They want to be connected to their tribes. They want to know what it means that I'm Potawatomi or Comanche or Alabama Casarte or Peoria or Modoc or, whichever. They want to know what it means. They want to know what their traditions are. They want to know what their language is. This is a fundamental part of their identity. They know a piece is missing. So I see this as doing a couple of things. Number one is helping to provide support to tribal officials and social services, because like I said, there are fiscal challenges, social challenges, chronological challenges, just because the resources are not there. There's only so much that 2 Indian child welfare workers for a tribe can do, especially when they have to cover any case that involves one of their kids in any one of the 50 states of the union, in addition to what happens locally. Helping to facilitate conversations with tribes around supporting kids to get their paperwork, because some kids do fall through the cracks. And unfortunately, what also happens more often than not is if a kid's determined not to be ICWA eligible, well, that's where it stops. Nobody talks about CDIB eligibility. Nobody talks about the fact that tribal membership is fluid. Tribes change their membership all the time. There are tribes in Oklahoma that are going through that process right now. But more importantly, to build bridges to other parts of the tribe and to their traditions, rather than merely saying, oh, you want to know about us? Well, go read our stuff on the History Department website. I don't know about other people's traditions, but I know about Anishinaabe traditions. A bunch of the stuff that's really important to us will never be in print anywhere. That stuff is oral tradition. I know that stuff because my dad taught it to me, his grandmother taught it to him. Getting on a website isn't necessarily going to get some of these kids to the place they want to be, especially with some of our traditions, whether, you know, Cherokee traditions, it's stomp traditions, or Chickasaw Nation. My traditions are all sorts of sweat and purification traditions. There's a lot of work to be done. And it's especially important for youth who are already traumatized by the child welfare system, to a certain degree embodying trauma because of this historical trauma tradition. It's important for them to think about who they are and where to go from here. So some information, and I'll go ahead and drop these in the chat box. Here's a bunch of stuff from the National Indian Child Welfare Association around cultural connectedness and well-being and family engagement. But the other thing I want to highlight right here is this newsletter. This newsletter is written by Kathy LaPlante, who is faculty in social work at the University of South Dakota. She's actually Otoe, Missouri. She's from Oklahoma. She worked for Cherokee Nation ICW for many years. She used to run the ICWA subdivision of LA County in Los Angeles for many years, or at least be one of their major case managers. But this article from the American Psychological Association talks explicitly on the importance of cultural connectedness for Indigenous foster youth. And I'll put all these links into the chat box. And I know I kind of flew through a lot of information, but there's a lot of stuff to cover. And so I just wanted to, if nothing else, for you to come out of this with a real appreciation for exactly how complex it is to be Indigenous, to understand what all of the factors are involved with being Indigenous, how it can relate to tribal practice and working with children and families, and get you thinking a little bit more about just how complicated it is to do this work, to do this well, and to respect both sovereignty and indigeneity.
Okay, thank you very much. I do have a question, Dr. Grinnell-Davis. Indigenous, Indian, Native American, what are the distinctions, and which is proper, what is improper? Because I don't know.
Yeah, that's a good question. If you ask me, and you ask me, what do I want to be called? I will tell you, I want to be called Anishinaabe. That's my people group. Because in general, we have historically not liked the big pan Indigenous terms, and there are political ramifications for using most of them, and that's important to understand too. Sometimes the best thing to do is just ask. In general, what we're beginning to tip toward is Indigenous with a capital I. And because that covers a whole host of areas, that also helps with our wahine out in the islands. So so the labeling, that's a big issue. I totally feel that. But in general, if you know the tribal group, that's safe. Indigenous is nearly always safe. I would be careful about using the term Aboriginal. That has really negative consequences in the United States. That has different meaning in Australia, has different meaning in Canada. But generally, if you know their tribal group, use that. So, you know, if you know you're dealing with Cherokee people, use Cherokee people. If you know you're talking to Creek people, use Creek or Muskoke. If you know, it's the tribal name, usually you can't go wrong. Indigenous people will usually flesh that out because you can't deny the indigeneity.
Right. So terrible, you think, too, referring to a Black person as a Black person, an African American, or a person of color. Would that be similar?
Similar, yeah. Okay. Yeah, I would put Indigenous in the same category with Black.
Okay. That makes, now in that perspective, that makes a lot more sense. So thank you for clarifying, because people just offend people accidentally out of ignorance, and I'm guilty sometimes. I don't know.
And the thing is, we can be guilty even with each other. Yeah. I mean, you know, if you've worked with, it's like I tell people all the time, and a number of you have heard me before, a few of you have even been my students. You work with one tribe, you've worked with one tribe.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I mean, even among the Cherokee, okay, you've got the Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians, you've got the United Keetoowah Band, you've got the Cherokee Nation of Oklahoma. They all have different ways of doing things, different things they specify, different things that are important. Mm-hmm. And so it's really important to pay recognition to the fact that even within the same group, I mean, there are 9 different Potawatomi nations. Wow. Which means there are 9 fights about language. I had a long conversation with Justin Neely at CPN about this. It's real. And it's hard because we're sitting here going, part of this feels like colonial policing. And it kind of stinks. I'm just going to be very frank and honest about it. But you have to be careful about who you say it stinks to and in front of, and how you frame it. Right. Because you can end up burning bridges in ways that, even as an Indigenous person, that you didn't realize you were burning.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Thank you so much, Dr. Davis, for your wonderful presentation. Very informative, and answering questions that came up. My question, I appreciate you very much for spending your Saturday with us, an hour of your Saturday. So thank you for that.
My pleasure. And like I said, I put the links to the various files that I had on my slide. I put them right in the chat. So if you want to copy those out of the chat, and then my contact information to my OU email is also in the chat. So
perfect. Thank you so much. You enjoy the rest of your evening.
I am planning on it. Thank you.